All right, guys, so this is the intro to bio. This is notes on the nature of biology and science. So all living things have the following characteristics. They contain order in some ways, so they're ordered in symmetrical ways, asymmetrical ways. They have evolutionary adaptation. They have responses to the environment. They undergo regulation internally and externally. They process energy. They reproduce, and they grow and develop. The basis of all life starts with cells. Cells are all going to share two characteristics. They're going to be enclosed by a membrane, and they're going to use DNA as a genetic information. From there, there's two types of cells. There's eukaryotes and prokaryotes. The cell here that I'm underlining is our eukaryotic cell. You can see it's big. It has organelles contained within it. It definitely looks more complicated. Then we've got our prokaryotic cell, which just contains DNA, no nucleus, and a membrane. And inside, it's just a bunch of stuff floating around needed for energy processing, but nothing much else. So there's 6 themes of biology that we're going to be exploring in much greater detail. The first one is interactions. Interactions just means organisms interact with each other and their environment. Energetics. In order to live, all organisms must have some way of creating energy which they then will use or other organisms will use. Structure and function. The structure of an organism or cell is almost always rooted in the function that it performs. Cell as the basic unit of life. The basic unit of life, like I mentioned before, is the cell. All living things are made up of one or more cells. Heritable information. Information is passed down through generations via DNA and RNA is responsible for making proteins. And then feedback mechanisms. There's a constant need to maintain homeostasis, which literally means the state of staying the same. Feedback mechanisms facilitate that particular homeostasis. Many disorders and diseases will interfere with feedback mechanisms. And then evolution. Evolution is what unifies all life. It is responsible for the diversity of life and the future diversity yet to come. So let's talk a little bit more about feedback regulations. So regulatory systems ensure a dynamic balance in living systems, so there's always regulation. We don't want to have too much or too little of anything. The chemical processes that are accelerated by this are called enzymes. Many biological processes are self-regulating, so the product itself regulates the process that it's actually going to do. So there's 2 types of feedback. There's negative feedback, which is the accumulation of a product which slows down the process. So for example, if you are in a place where you're too hot, your brain gets a signal, sends a signal to the rest of the body. So what's the response? You start to sweat, and your blood vessels begin to contract, which will allow more blood to flow, cooling you down, which is why also you'll get a little red when it's hot. In positive feedback, which is a little bit less common, the product of itself speeds up its own production. So an example is childbirth, where a child ready to be born will cause contractions to occur. Those contractions will facilitate the release of a hormone, and that hormone will then facilitate more contractions. So we have contractions, those release hormones. The release of those hormones produces more contractions, and that's going to cause positive feedback. So another big topic in biology is evolution. So the history of Earth is a saga of a changing Earth billions of years ago. Charles Darwin was one of the first who came up with this evolutionary view of life when he published his book on the origin of species by natural selection. So his book articulated 2 points: descent with modification, the view that contemporary species, so species today, arose from a succession of ancestors, so it came from previous ancestors. He also coined the term natural selection, which was the mechanism for how descent with modification occurred. So bats having wings the way that they are is an example of an adaptation. So let's move into science inquiry. So inquiry is a search for information and explanation, and we often focus on specific questions. So there's two types. There's discovery science, which is just describing nature, describing what we see happening, and then hypothesis-based science, which is explaining nature, explaining what we're seeing. Two types of data, you guys have already seen this. Quantitative data, which is numerical, so those are your numbers, 14 centimeters, and then qualitative data, which is recorded descriptions where you're talking about hair color or eye color or shape or patterns, things like that. So in hypothesis-based science, we're usually proposing and testing hypotheses, and hypotheses are the hypothetical explanation. So they are hypothetical in that it's what we believe to see, but until we test them, they will remain hypothetical. So a hypothesis is a tentative answer to a well-framed question. A hypothesis is an explanation, which leads to a prediction that can be tested. So the whole point is to go from hypothesis to testing. So let's take this example. You make an observation. The light switch, or flashlight, doesn't work. You propose a question. Why doesn't it work? So you test you have two hypotheses. Either the batteries are dead or the bulb is burnt out. So what do you do to find out which hypothesis is the correct hypothesis? Well, you test. So then to test the dead batteries, you replace the dead batteries, you turn it on, you find out that, nope, batteries did not turn the flashlight on. You test the second hypothesis, replace the bulb, turn on the flashlight, and wow, look at that. You have a flashlight that turns on when you change the bulb. Now you can say that your second hypothesis, the burnt out bulb, is supported by the test that you did. Okay, you have to have two important parts of a hypothesis. It has to be testable and it must be falsifiable, meaning you can test it, but you can also disprove it, so to speak, or to say that it's not supported by the data that you collected. The scientific method is more of a cookie cutter process of inquiry. It's very few scientists that actually adhere to this definition of scientific method. It really is more complicated than that. So this right here is kind of very cookie cutter, not necessarily what real science looks like. What is our limitations of science? Well, we're only limited by our naturalism. So science seeks natural causes for natural phenomena. If science cannot support or falsify supernatural explanations, we say that those things are outside of our boundaries, or outside of our bounds of science. So we can't say for certain if magic is real or ghosts are real, because those are things that cannot be supported or falsified. A theory is much broader than a hypothesis. It includes much more information and much more topics. So it's usually broad in scope, so very general topic. It usually generates new hypotheses, and it's supported by a large body of evidence. I think that is the most important part here. The culture of science is that it's actually a very intensely social activity. You have to cooperate, but also compete in science, and that kind of categorizes or characterizes its culture. Mostly the goal of science is to understand natural phenomena. We can take that natural phenomena and use technology to apply that information for a specific purpose, like making new medicines or treatments for diseases that were not previously made before. That's the end of this set of notes. If you need to go back, please make sure you do. And in class, let me know if you have any questions.